Thank you. My name's Evan Fraser. I work at the University of Guelph, and I'd like you to imagine a scene. Start with thinking of downtown Shanghai's concrete and aluminum jungle, and then cast your mind 70 miles west, inland, to a relic of a very different age. Lake Taihu, which is the place I'd like you to imagine, is a place venerated in Chinese poetry. Generations of Confucian scholars stared at its limestone crags, its gentle lapping waters, because in Lake Taihu, perhaps more than the rolling seas of the towering mountains, was where, to the Chinese anyways, nature revealed her most aesthetic form. Today, however, Lake Taihu is better known as a source of a creeping infection called algae blooms. Beginning in the mid-20th century, scientists began to notice green growth spreading out of isolated spots. The growths were a form of algae that choked all other aquatic life, poisoned the water for drinking. Starting in a single bay at the northern end of the lake, the blooms extended every summer. And over the last 50 years, each summer they now cover about a third of the lake. The algae makes the water thicken and stink. And a key organism in this bloom is a type of cyanobacteria that is highly toxic to humans. When I visited about 10 years ago, it was causing massive public health outbreaks every summer. Newspapers were regularly running pictures of entire cities switching to bottled water, and images of the algae being pumped out of the lake and into fleets of waiting tanker trucks were common. Such gigantic algae blooms are the fault of human agency, and in particular of farming. The runoff from food production around Lake Taihu resulted in thousands of tons of nitrogen and phosphorus trickling into the lake each year, feeding the growth. Of this, manufactured fertilizer was only a relatively minor part. Animal sewage was the primary culprit. Now let's be clear. Industrial agriculture across the world has helped eliminate chronic malnutrition for billions of people. It has taken chronic malnutrition away from much of China. But the environmental cost of this form of food production is mounting. As of the year 2000, a third of U.S. surface water was unfit for animal habitat or human consumption. Almost all of this problem was blamed on agriculture. A full 70% of the tainted water in the U.S. got that way because of the runoff of farming. As far back as 1994, for instance, farmers in the Passaro Valley River watershed in California were dousing their fields with over 5 million kilograms of pesticides each year. The scientists who monitored the impact of this observed high rates of toxicity in 78% of ditch samples. They went on, 25% of tributary samples and 11% of river estuary samples were toxic. In the dry language of the United Nations bureaucrats working at the Food and Agriculture Organization, agriculture is the single largest user of fresh water on a global basis and is a major cause of degradation of surface and groundwater resources through erosion and runoff. Of course, these issues hit close to home as well. It seems that every other year, a combination of ag runoff and the right weather conditions lead to algae explosions everywhere, including in Lake Erie, where I spent summers on my grandparents' farm. Satellite imagery from 2011 shows 5,000 square kilometers of the lake covered in a blue-greeny soup. And the trends are actually bad, with the problem seeming to have worsened over the last 2 decades. But we have to ask the question, what's happening here? I'm a child of the 1970s, and when I was a kid, I was aware that Lake Erie was polluted. But by the 80s and 90s, the beach near my grandparents' farm was open to swimming again. So what's happened that caused us to take this step back? Well, a number of things I think can be accounted for this. First, a major problem in the 1970s was the runoff from municipal sewage. But luckily, that was a problem that was relatively easily solved by changing the engineering and the regulations around treating sewage. Since then, though, a number of changes have happened. First, urban development have meant that land that used to be covered in vegetation that would trap water before it got into the rivers has been turned into parking lots and subdivisions. And so now rain hits with a lot greater force and runs off into the rivers much more quickly. But the real problem seems to be the amount of phosphorus we're dumping into the lake. Today, the main source of phosphorus is indeed agriculture, with golf courses and lawn fertilizing representing a small but significant chunk. In essence, our agricultural systems have had the inadvertent effect of fertilizing our lakes. And much like applying fertilizer to our fields promotes plant growth, when we allow those nutrients to flow into the lakes, it allows algae to flourish. But these algae blooms that I've been talking about are really the visible manifestation of this problem. So to understand this, I'd like you all to imagine that you're a fish swimming on the shore of, on the surface of Lake Erie, close to where a river tributary runs in after a rainfall. As the rain hit the ground and washed the nutrients into the water, they end up next to you, the fish. And in a hot summer day, around you, the algae starts growing. So let's now dive a little deeper into the lake where the water is clear and it's below the layer of the algae. But unfortunately, even here, the water's chemistry and biology are changing. As the algae bloom matures, it begins to die, and as that plant matter dies, it settles to the bottom, and as it does it, like all organic matter does, it decomposes. And when organic matter decomposes, it absorbs oxygen, in this case taking oxygen out of the water. In a recent report on the state of Lake Erie by the International Joint Commission, which is a bilateral organization between US and Canadian governments to deal with shared watersheds, in the words of that organization, quote, high external nutrient inputs stimulate the production of excessive organic material, including algae and other organisms in the sunlit layers, and the subsequent decomposition of this material in the bottom layers rapidly depletes the supply of oxygen, creating dead zones where dissolved oxygen levels are so low that fish and other aquatic life cannot survive. And so, the effect of our farming systems are a toxic green soup on the surface of many of our most important rivers and lakes in particular, and dead zones that cannot support aquatic life in the deeper, cooler waters. Luckily, though, there are solutions to these problems. For instance, there's technologies emerging that fall under the broad heading of precision agriculture that allow farmers to be far more efficient with their inputs. For instance, it's now possible in dairy farms to use microchips to monitor each cow's health and metabolism in near real time. Computer-controlled feeding stalls that help identify how each cow and only give the right amount of food for that particular animal. This can help reduce the amount of excess nutrients a cow might be fed that would then be excreted back into the environment. Similar technologies can be applied at irrigation systems and tractors to ensure that fields do not receive more nitrogen or phosphorus than the plants can actually use. There's also more agronomic approaches, such as planting vegetative buffers around streams to trap water runoff before the nutrients end up in waterways. Rotating crops can build up organic matter, which is important in soils because organic matter also acts like a trap, holding on to nutrients for the plants and preventing it from being washed into the streams. And of course, there have to be sort of regulatory solutions, such as restricting the number of animals or livestock units that are permissible in certain watersheds. The problems that I've described today, the problems of water pollution caused by agriculture, are grave and widespread, but they are not necessary. Addressing this suite of issues requires a suite of solutions, the combination of technology, sound landscape management, decent regulations. These strategies are needed to ensure that the nutrients we apply to our farms stay on our farms where they promote the kinds of plants and animal growth that we want, and they don't end up being applied so inefficiently that they run into rivers and lakes where they cause a huge number of environmental problems. Thank you very much.